Paul, I have a deep feeling that being here on Dune with these Fremen will reveal something to you. Something you can't even imagine.
A person needs new experiences. They jar something inside, allowing you to grow. Without changes, something sleeps inside us and seldom awakens. The sleeper must awaken. Vegetation on Dune. We have the water. Have you seen the big reservoir here? And Kynes has bulbs.
Dune is a real-time strategic adventure game developed by Crew Interactive and published by Virgin Games for MS-DOS and Amiga in spring 1992. Dune takes place on Arrakis, a brutal desert planet where two intergalactic noble houses battle for control of the priceless spice melange. Players take the role of Paul, the young heir to House Atreides, who must befriend the native tribes of Dune and rally them against the oppressive House Harkonnen. At first, Paul's greatest tools are diplomacy, leadership, and the wisdom of his advisors, but as the fires of war spread across the planet, Paul learns that neither the Fremen nor the spice are entirely what they seem. Dune is loosely based on the 1965 novel of the same name. Frank Herbert's story of war, religion, politics, and ecology was an international hit, becoming one of the most well-regarded and best-selling sci-fi stories in history, so it wasn't long before plans were made to translate the novel to other mediums. There were several abortive attempts to bring Dune to the silver screen, the most notorious being Holy Mountain director Alejandro Jodorowsky's failed 1974 production, which the filmmaker himself later characterized as a 12-hour LSD trip and raping Frank Herbert, but with love. Alien director Ridley Scott took the reins in 1979, but the scope of the project, combined with the sudden death of Scott's older brother, caused him to leave prematurely. It was David Lynch who took up the mantle of director in 1981, with Kyle MacLachlan playing the role of Paul Atreides. Lynch's Dune was intended to be the first in a trilogy, Star Wars for adults, as Universal Studios saw it. The production was marred by significant difficulties, not least disagreement over the movie's length. Lynch believed that a runtime of 3 hours was necessary, whilst the movie's financial backers demanded it be cut down to 2 hours, so that it could be screened more times per day and generate higher box office revenue. The rough cut of the film clocked in at 4 hours, resulting in extensive cuts that left the movie's narrative in tatters, and forcing reshoots by the De Laurentiis production company to try and tie the remaining footage together. Lynch's Dune finally made it to cinemas in 1984. It was a box office bomb that was almost universally reviled by critics, savaged as both bloated and incomprehensible. The planned sequels were scrapped, and Lynch was so distraught over the movie's production that he permanently washed his hands of it. Author and critic Harlan Ellison was one of the film's few defenders, as was Frank Herbert himself, who continued to speak positively of the movie right up until his death in 1986. And it was this movie that provided publisher Virgin Games the opportunity to bring Dune to home computers. Virgin's Martin Alper was a longtime fan of the novel, and had spent years trying to acquire the rights to make a video game of Dune. Things appeared to be coming together in 1989, and Alper floated the idea of adapting Dune to French developer Creux. Creux was certainly not the safest choice for a high-profile franchise like Dune. The Paris-based studio was founded by veterans of developer Exhaust, who had fled after the company was bought out by publishing giant Infogrames. Creux had a reputation for having something of an artistic temperament, even by French standards, performing ritual sacrifices and pantomime murders to promote their games at European trade shows. At Exhaust, their two best-known titles were similarly unconventional. Captain Blood was a point-and-click adventure/space sim, featuring over 36,000 planets, and involved a disintegrating cyborg hunting down his own clone bodies. Players would visit a planet and then pilot drones across the surface, dodging obstacles and evading missiles to contact representatives of the various alien races. Interacting with these aliens involved using a universal translation device to try and discover the coordinates of other habitable planets and the rebellious clones. Or the player could simply annihilate the planet and spend an eternity lost among the stars. Meanwhile, Cult, known as Chamber of the Sci-Fi Mutant Goddesses outside of Europe, was a turn-based point-and-click adventure with RPG elements. Players controlled Raven, a psionic mutant, in his quest to rescue the beautiful Sci-Fi from the cult of the Protozorks. Players had to use their psionic powers to solve puzzles, overpower enemies, and escape deadly traps before time ran out. Both titles received lukewarm to positive reviews, praised for their originality and artistic value, but viewed less favourably when it came to actual gameplay. Amiga Power probably summed up the attitude of many reviewers towards Creux in describing Cult as a wacko French adventure thing. Nevertheless, when Martin Alper acquired the rights to adapt the 1984 movie, it was Creux that Alper chose to realise the dream of Dune on home computers. It was clear from the very start that the road to Dune would not be an easy one. Creux had to answer to several different masters at Virgin. One was of course Martin Alper and Virgin Games USA. There was also Virgin's French division, where Creux at least had some friends. But Creux's immediate superiors were Virgin's UK office and David Bishop, an old enemy of Creux from the days of Exhaust and the Infogrames takeover. Bishop met with Creux in September 1989, where he reportedly made it abundantly clear that it was he, not Creux, who dictated the game's design. Before Creux were allowed to write a single line of code, they were required to spend several months storyboarding their vision for Dune, and this vision did not match that of their British and American backers. Creux still saw themselves very much as artists. They argued that it was impossible to outclass Japanese developers in arcade-style games, and that French developers should focus on the medium of graphic adventures, which they viewed as more in tune with their culture. Creux often characterized their vision of Dune as cinematic, incorporating film-like sequences inspired by the movie, and pushed for the game to be distributed on the new CD-ROM format, which would have enabled them to create a richer audio-visual experience. But Virgin's priority was to produce a commercially successful title that would have an international appeal, particularly in the American market. Creux's pitch was, in Martin Alper's words, far too French. Virgin immediately shot down the idea of a CD-ROM release, and were unimpressed by the concept of blending adventure with strategy. They also criticised the planned user interface as too complex, and believed that the game's use of cinematic sequences would quickly bore players. In the view of the UK office, Creux's Dune would require 50 floppy disks and a development time that would exceed the average human lifespan. Creux's impassioned defense of the artistic value of their pitch only confirmed Martin Alper's suspicion that Creux were not the right fit for the project, and in September of 1990, Virgin cancelled that project. Or at least they thought they had, because Creux started formal production on Dune anyway. Exactly how that happened is subject to several contradictory stories, but the most reliable account, reported by journalist Danielle Ishbia, is that Crew still had allies at Virgin's French division. Virgin France secretly continued to fund Dune's development, believing that their superiors would forgive the deception if Crew could put something playable together before they were exposed. For almost a year, Crew worked in secret on the title, but still incorporated Virgin's suggestions into the design since they did, after all, intend to try and court them again. Crew found further inspiration in an unexpected but fortuitous muse: the first Gulf War of 1990 to 1991. The Iraqi invasion of Kuwait and American-led response was a cultural milestone for many, with live footage of the front lines of the war broadcast directly to homes, an extensive discussion in the media of the strategic and tactical progress of the war as it happened. The images of desert warfare and nighttime airstrikes profoundly affected Crew's depiction of the battle for Arrakis. As Crew's Dune became more tangible, the studio decided that they were ready to take another gamble, and began previewing the game to a select group of journalists. Crew hoped to generate enough interest in the gaming press that, once the deception were uncovered, Virgin would be too afraid of negative coverage to confirm their cancellation of the project. In the end, however, it wasn't Virgin themselves who exposed Crew. It was Sega. In early 1991, Virgin France were purchased by Sega of Japan, who sent representatives to audit the company's finances. Crew had simultaneously lost their allies and clandestine funding from the French division, and been found out by Virgin Games' upper management. Crew's Philip Ulrich was summoned to Virgin's London office to face Martin Alper and David Bishop with whatever he had been able to scrounge together of the game. To Ulrich's surprise, Crew were given a stay of execution. Alper snorted at the demo, flatly stating that Dune was still unplayable, but was impressed by how much progress had been made on the title since the original storyboards. Virgin gave Crew an ultimatum. They had 5 weeks to turn Dune into a real, playable game, paying particular attention to the tastes of the American audience. And if they succeeded, Virgin would continue funding development. Crew undertook a massive overhaul of the game, streamlining the narrative and fleshing out the gameplay, and it paid off. In July 1991, Virgin resumed support for Dune. But there was still work to be done. Virgin hoped to launch the game on a variety of platforms, including the Sega Mega Drive and Nintendo Super Famicom, even though the home computer version was still far from completion. Virgin also asked that the game's visual direction be brought more closely in line with Lynch's Dune, but Martin Alper only had the license for the movie, not the likeness of many of the movie's stars, such as Kyle MacLachlan, Patrick Stewart, or Sting. Previews for the game show how the game's NPCs are often updated according to the status of ongoing negotiations with the actors, in some cases being original art, then based on the real-life versions, then changed back to the original art, and so on. And the matter of the license seems to have been a matter of further confusion. In numerous previews, Crew's Dune was described as being a hybrid of events from the original novel, the 1984 movie, and original content. Crew seemed to have contributed to this perception, often discussing how their game would capture specific themes from Herbert's work rather than Lynch's film. Representatives of Virgin were much more careful in interviews, choosing very specific language that gave the impression Crew's Dune was, at least formally and legally speaking, based solely on the movie. And Crew were no longer the only developer making use of that license. When Martin Alper lost faith in Crew back in autumn 1990, he took Dune to another developer, Westwood Studios, who began work on a strategy game that combined elements of SSI's war games with the construction and management elements of Civilization. But in 1991, Westwood's Dune was not as far into development as Crew's version, nor did it have the same immediate visual appeal, and contemporary press was, at first, far more impressed by the French game. Virgin decided to keep Crew's Dune as the original title, and market Westwood's Dune as a sequel, a decision that infuriated both studios. Dune was finally shipped for DOS and Commodore Amiga computers in Easter 1992, enjoying mostly positive reviews. The game's graphics, art direction, and soundtrack received universal praise, and Computer Gaming World called the game's cinematic style dazzling. Reviewers also liked the game's opening sections, saying they were both accessible and interesting. But many reviewers were more critical of Dune's gameplay depth and lasting appeal, arguing that cinematic sequences soon became repetitive, and that the game's puzzles and strategic elements were too dull and simplistic to maintain the player's interest. Some reviews considered Dune to be too linear and railroaded, with several likening it to an interactive movie, and one magazine going so far as to dismiss the game as a slideshow. Reviewers familiar with Frank Herbert's book were also quite critical of the game's narrative and NPCs, saying Crew had cut out or distorted too much of the original story. All the same, the game sold well, and Virgin authorized a CD-ROM version of Dune for both home computers and Sega's Mega CD console, released in 1993 with several audio-visual additions, such as a new opening, FMV cutscenes for several sequences, clips from the original 1984 movie, and fully voiced dialogue for all the NPCs. The CD-ROM version also reviewed well and achieved good sales, but by 1993, reviews of Westwood's adaptation of Dune had started to trickle in. The gaming press were now much more positively inclined towards Dune 2, with a general consensus that though it lacked the cinematic style of its predecessor, the gameplay far outclassed Crew's title. Crew had originally hoped to produce their own sequel, a dark side of Dune that focused on playing as the savage and duplicitous House Harkonnen, but the key figures involved in Dune soon moved on to other projects at Crew, most notably the 1995 adventure Lost Eden, characterized as a continuation of many of the ideas Crew had experimented with in Dune. Almost 10 years after the release of the original game, Crew Interactive announced it was funding the production of 2 new Dune titles. Frank Herbert's Dune, a third-person action-adventure based on the sci-fi miniseries of the same name, and Dune Generations, a massively multiplayer strategy which combined empire building, diplomacy, space combat, and traditional RTS gameplay. But when Frank Herbert's Dune was released in 2001, it faced extremely poor reviews and disastrous sales. Crew filed for bankruptcy in 2002, and Dune Generations, despite having already reached closed beta status, was cancelled, marking the end of Crew's relationship with the franchise. Today, Dune 2 is widely credited as the grandfather of the real-time strategy genre, but Crew's original computer adaptation of Dune has faded into the background as a historical curiosity. Except, that is, for an even more curious footnote in the game's history. A fan-made remake of Dune by artist David Belsemik, started around 2016 and formally completed as of 2022. Behind the Dune aspired to be both a pornographic parody of Crew's game and a more faithful adaptation of the original Frank Herbert novel. In this video, I'll be reviewing Crew's CD-ROM release of Dune, and after that we can have a look at David Balsamic's remake. So strap on your stillsuit and sheath your crysknife, because it's time to head to Arrakis.
May I show you the characteristics of my troop? We need bulbs to start vegetation. Show me where you want me to go.
Arrakis is divided into around 50 or 60 regions, with each region dominated by a specific settlement type. The Atreides and Harkonnen families each control a single palace, the Atreides at Carthage and the Harkonnen at Arrakeen, which serves as their headquarters and is effectively impregnable until the conclusion of the campaign. The other settlement types are CHs, which are controlled by the native Fremen tribes, fortresses, which are controlled by the Harkonnens, and independent villages who will sell items and equipment to the Atreides. Playing as Paul Atreides, we start in the palace at Carthage and are introduced to the basics of the game's control scheme and dialogue system. Everything is handled in a very typical point-and-click adventure game format, with players moving between different scenes and given the option to talk to NPCs or occasionally interact with an important item in the room. Most of the NPCs in the palace fulfill a specific role, Paul's father, Duke Leto Atreides, will give Paul his primary objective, which for now is to contact the native Fremen tribes and set up the Atreides spice mining operations. Paul's mother, the Bene Gesserit witch Jessica, doesn't have much purpose at this point in the game, but will become more important later on. Duncan Idaho holds an administrative role, updating Paul on the status of the Atreides spice reserves and dealing with any transactions that take place. Later in the game, Thethia Hawat, the Atreides head of intelligence, will arrive at the palace. But right now, our first port of call is one of the nearby Fremen CHs, where a Fremen leader and Gurney Halleck, our security operative, are waiting. Travelling by foot is suicidal, so players will have to fly there by ornithopter, though alternative methods of transportation become available much later. The first Fremen leader is happy to join up with the Atreides, and this is where we're introduced to the strategic side of the campaign. Each Fremen tribe consists of several hundred to several thousand men, who for now can only be commanded to mine for spice, move to another location, or search for equipment. Maintaining the Atreides spice reserves is absolutely critical, as it's not only a form of currency for buying equipment from smugglers, but also part of the Atreides tithe sent to Emperor Shaddam IV. The Emperor will demand a large shipment of spice every 5 or 6 days, and missing this deadline by several days will result in the Emperor dispatching his elite Sardaukar to Dune, causing an immediate game over. As the campaign progresses, the Emperor will request much larger shipments, so the player needs to maximize how much spice they extract and how fast they extract it to keep up with those demands. For spice mining, the most important equipment is a harvester, which will help the troop extract spice at a much higher rate, and their own ornithopter, which will increase their movement speed and prevent the harvester from being swallowed by one of the giant sandworms that roam Arrakis. Once we've met Gurney Halleck and recruited the first Fremen chief to start mining spice, Gurney will join the player's party. Having specific NPCs in your party is necessary to advance the story at various locations, but they may bring other benefits, like Jessica being able to find secret doors in the palace, or the Fremen Stilgar convincing other tribal leaders to help you. Gurney will become more important later on in the campaign, when the option for Fremen to train as military units becomes available. Dropping Gurney off in a CH will dramatically improve the rate at which army units in that region improve their skills. The skill level of a tribe affects how good they are at different roles, so a tribe skilled in spice mining will mine faster and more efficiently, whilst their skill level in the army role affects how well they fight against Harkonnen troops. Battles take place when Harkonnen occupy the same region as allied Fremen, and the outcome is determined by the number of troops involved, the troops' military skills, their equipment, and their motivation level. The Fremen in Cryu's game are most certainly not the super soldiers of Frank Herbert's book. In fact, Fremen are effectively worthless in battle until they've achieved a reasonably high level of skill in the army role and are kitted out with some basic weapons, starting with crysknives and going all the way up to atomics.
Oh my god, atomics.
Aside from spice mining, military service, and a unique unit of Fremen prospectors, there's a third role for Fremen tribes, called ecology. The Fremen secretly dream of transforming Dune from a desert world into a natural paradise, which they could one day achieve with the expertise of Imperial planetologist Liet Kynes. Once the player has met Kynes and done a task for him, Fremen tribes can visit Kynes' CH to pick up plant bulbs and begin working as ecologists. Ecologists can build a wind trap in a CH and start growing plant life, which will turn that area into an ecological reserve. Vegetation, if maintained, will then begin creeping north into adjacent regions. Converting a region into an ecological reserve will significantly increase the overall motivation of the Fremen tribes, but it also destroys the spice in that region, causing any Harkonnen troops to leave that area and go somewhere else. There is a finite amount of spice available on Dune, and since the Emperor will keep demanding larger and larger tithes, the player needs to discover as many CHs as possible. There are several ways to uncover a CH, the most common being clues from a Fremen chief or Fremen NPCs like Hara, Stilgar, or Cheney. Fremen will often mention the general location of a CH, such as northeast of an already discovered location. The player has to fly their Orni in that direction and wait for it to appear on the minimap or an NPC to point it out. But the player's ultimate goal isn't to discover all the CHs in the game and mine spice. To win the campaign, they need to conquer all of the Harkonnen fortresses, which dominate Dune's northern regions. You can't find these in an ornithopter, since the Harkonnen will simply shoot you down if you get too close, so you need to either interrogate Harkonnen prisoners acquired in battle, or send troops out on espionage missions. There are approximately 20 to 30 Harkonnen fortresses, and at a certain point in the campaign the Harkonnens will start launching invasions of your own regions, so players need to juggle a lot of different responsibilities at once. This is an extremely time-consuming process that requires Paul to visit each Fremen tribe in person to give orders, but there's one more crucial gameplay element that will make things easier. Paul is developing psychic powers from his exposure to the spice melange, which allows him to telepathically contact any Fremen who have already agreed to join the Atreides. When this power first emerges, Paul can only contact allied Fremen in adjacent regions, but as the campaign develops, he'll be able to project his consciousness at greater distances. This power is represented by Paul's charisma stat, which will improve based on his success with the Fremen, progressing through the story, and speaking to his mother Jessica after certain milestones. Eventually, Paul will be able to contact allied Fremen anywhere on the planet. In short, conquering Arrakis means producing enough spice to pay off the Emperor, raising the Fremen's motivation via ecology, and having enough well-trained and well-equipped troops to drive the Harkonnens off Dune for good. Dune is an odd duck. It's trying to capture a fairly broad range of events from the source material, including Dune's spice mining operations, the conflict with House Harkonnen, the Atreides' diplomatic and religious overtures to the Fremen, the terraforming of Arrakis, and Paul's journey of transhumanist self-discovery. It's not surprising that Dune therefore fits rather awkwardly into conventional genre definitions. But it does fit. Virgin Games may have invented the term real-time tactical adventure, but it's convenient shorthand for a game that combines very basic elements of a traditional point-and-click adventure with empire management games of the late 80s and early 90s. Dune exemplifies the wide but shallow approach to design. There are a lot of different elements to the gameplay. The first quarter of Dune does a great job easing the player into these mechanics, especially since it happens alongside extensive storytelling and cinematic sequences, but the gilding starts to flake off pretty fast. Dune often feels overcomplicated, not in the sense that any of the mechanics have much depth to them, more that performing even the most basic actions can involve an unnecessarily lengthy or convoluted sequence of events. It doesn't take long for the player to get tired of the repetition of flying the Orni everywhere, particularly when you have to sit through the entire flight to find a hidden CH, and you'll soon despise Emperor Shaddam IV. Not for story reasons, but because of the excruciating process of paying your tithe. You have to wait for the Emperor to send a message, then head to the communication room to play that message, then go find Duncan Idaho, clicking through his dialogue until he asks you if you want to pay the tithe, agree to pay, get Duncan to join your party, go back to the comms room, sit through an unskippable cutscene, talk to Duncan enough times to get him to say the Emperor has replied, play the Emperor's new message, and finally go back to what you were doing before. You can mitigate this a little bit by overpaying your tithe, but it's still incredibly annoying due to how fast time passes during gameplay. At the start of the game it's not too awful since you have a fair bit of different stuff to do in that time frame, but soon enough most of your time will be spent flying back and forth to find new CHs, buying equipment from smugglers, and giving orders to the Fremen tribes, so it sometimes feels like you barely get anything done between dealing with spice shipments. And the process of actually giving orders to allied Fremen tribes is equally unintuitive, as it requires clicking through a lot of different menus, especially when you want to check something out before committing to an order. It feels like one redundancy built on top of another. To be fair, most wargames or empire management titles of the day were like this, but you can see one of the reasons Westwood's Dune impressed people so much by comparison. Sid Meier's Civilization and Technosoft's Herzog 2 are often credited as Dune 2's progenitors, but Westwood founder Brett Sperry has said that it was the Apple II operating system that really inspired the game's control scheme and user interface. Compared to Cryu's Dune, Dune 2's strategic gameplay is slick, intuitive, and responsive, and there's good reason it's been the de facto standard for RTS games ever since. Obviously, it doesn't help that Dune 2's gameplay involves fast-paced action and big flashy explosions, whereas Dune exists in this strange limbo dimension where you're operating at a level that is simultaneously too macro and too micro. What I mean to say is that Paul has to go through the laborious process of arranging incredibly minor details, like flying around looking for CHs, visiting smugglers to purchase equipment, arming individual tribes of Fremen, arranging spice shipments, dropping off military advisors, and constantly interacting with individual NPCs. But Paul also has to deal with the Atreides' overall economic and strategic position on Dune. The player has to micromanage all the banality that goes into setting up a battle with the Harkonnen, but does none of the interesting stuff, like actually joining in or controlling the battle themselves. Of course, you do have to manage all the boring stuff that comes after the battle, like recruiting any prisoners liberated by your forces, giving them new training orders, and getting them kitted out with new equipment. There comes a point in the campaign where this is pretty much all you're doing, moving your forces to a Harkonnen fortress, waiting for the battle to finish, waiting a whole day for the troops to convert the fortress into a CH, moving your prospectors to the region, checking all your troops' equipment, bringing a tribe in to harvest the spice, sending out a unit to find the next fortress, and doing it all over again. So the strategic element of Dune is just not very good. It's shallow, and it's made doubly repetitive by the layer upon layer of pointless busywork involved. It's tempting to say that the strategic side of the game was tacked on, but that's not really true, since it implies A, that this part of the game is merely a sideshow, and B, that the adventure side of the game is any more sophisticated. The strategy aspect is not tacked on to Dune. It's central to the game, and it absolutely dominates the second half of the campaign. And the adventure gameplay is no deeper. If anything, you could almost argue that Dune is an empire management game using the interface and control scheme of an adventure game, a digital face dancer if you like. There's very little to do in Carthag, the villages, or the caverns of the CHs. When you talk to an NPC who doesn't have a specific practical role, all you can really do is click the Talk to Me button until they run out of useful information. As noted earlier, NPCs might give you clues to your objective or reveal the general location of an undiscovered CH, but the player has no real agency here. There are no puzzles to speak of, no real negotiation or choices to make outside of purchasing equipment and weapons. Even if an NPC won't do something for you, they'll usually tell you to go talk to someone else, who will tell you to talk to someone else, who will then tell you to go back to the original NPC, and suddenly everything will be all worked out. At no point is there any critical thinking involved. You just do whatever you're told, explicitly or via rather unsubtle clues, and if you forget, you can always go back to one of the named NPCs and click through the dialogue again. It's very different to, say, Cryu's KGB, a notoriously unforgiving thriller that was much more in the vein of traditional adventure games, with many different options for dialogue and environmental interaction. I'm not saying Dune, taken as a whole, is a movie game, though it would be without the strategic element. Once you've unlocked most of the troop roles and the campaign has gotten rolling, there is a certain amount of thought that goes into responding to where the Harkonnen strike first, where you concentrate your military forces, which regions you decide to terraform, and so on. This can even, unintentionally, upset the fairly smooth difficulty curve that Cryu intended. At one point in the game, several diseases broke out among my forces, rendering them useless, including all the tribes I'd been training in military matters. This disease can only be cured by a specific NPC who has to hang around the region for a couple of days, but at this point the Harkonnen invaded the area and captured this NPC. Since my armies were still sitting in another CH afflicted with the disease, I had nobody to recapture the region. This meant I had to spend a significant amount of time training new forces and finding new weapons, whilst the Harkonnens continued to seize my territory and the Fremen's motivation plummeted. I did finally recapture the NPC, who cured the last diseased area, and was immediately recaptured by the Harkonnen in a scripted story event. Now, this whole sequence might have been quite fun, maybe even challenging in a more tactical or action-oriented strategy, but the game being what it is, all this process involved was moving little groups of men about and dealing with spice orders. Not the most gripping story. It would be easy to cast our minds back to Dune's rocky development and blame this all on Virgin Games. We know, from Cryu's account at least, that Dune was heavily streamlined. It's implied that, like the source material, the game was not supposed to begin on Arrakis, and had scenes on other planets. Maybe these parts of the game were meant to have meatier adventure-oriented gameplay, whilst the parts on Arrakis would have been less scripted and focused on strategy. Or maybe the game as a whole was meant to be much more than a point-and-click adventure/strategy. I noticed at least 2 previews claiming that Cryu's Dune would feature the famous crysknife duel from the movie's climax. Off the top of my head, there are 3 major crysknife duels in Lynch's movie, and the book briefly mentioned Paul having to fight dozens of duels during his time with the Fremen. Okay, it's possible this was never meant to be in the game and the press simply misunderstood, but I remember Legend Entertainment hoping to do something similar in their original adaptation of Robert Jordan's Wheel of Time. That is, creating a sort of sword-fighting minigame based on the practices described in the novels. I do wonder if Cryu's version of Dune was originally meant to be something more like, say, Sid Meier's Pirates. Like Dune, Pirates wasn't necessarily trying to fit into a specific genre, but aiming to emulate the experience of something. In this case, popular depictions of buccaneers, from Treasure Island to Errol Flynn. Pirates wasn't exactly an RPG, nor was it an action game, nor a strategy, nor any one specific genre. It was, as they say, more than the sum of its parts. It's worth noting that some reviewers made the same criticisms of Pirates as they would of Dune, that this scattershot of minigames failed to hold up under the scrutiny of a full playthrough. But Pirates was overall better received, both then and now, and even got a remake in the 2000s, an official one, not a pornographic one. Is this what Cryu's Dune was meant to be? Not a tactical adventure, but a massive, multi-genre spanning epic? Well, let's be careful here. Keep in mind that Pirates was very much gameplay focused, whereas Cryu's original vision for Dune was, by their own account, much more cinematic. From what I've read, it was Virgin, not Cryu, who felt Dune was too shallow and cinematic, and Virgin who pushed for more gameplay depth. In its final form, Dune is already quite linear, a slideshow to its worst critics, so I'm hesitant to lament Cryu's frustrated artistic vision. At the start of the game, everything is fresh and exciting, and we're being carried along by this interactive narrative, but then we're reading the same dialogue, watching the same cutscenes, receiving the same administrative reports over and over. If we look at the facts, Cryu, both the team that worked on Dune and the wider company, earned themselves a reputation for being more interested in artistic expression than, well, making computer games. In an obituary for Cryu, one former PC Gamer reviewer described Cryu as having defied sense, taste, and coherence to produce an endless stream of the worst, most clumsy, most drearily pre-rendered mist clones the world has ever seen. I read a couple of articles claiming that people at Cryu were friends with Alejandro Jodorowsky of that failed 1974 attempt to film Dune, and if true, I think it's quite fitting as coincidences go. Nobody can dispute that Cryu often made earnest and interesting games. Whether they made good games is an entirely different matter. Still, Dune is probably the most well-known and well-received game in the developer's catalogue, and it's not like there are too many titles around today doing what Dune did back in 1992. Harlan Ellison famously described David Lynch's Dune as a book that shouldn't have been shot, a script that couldn't have been written, a directorial job beyond anyone's doing, a production that could not be marketed, that could not be understood, that seemed to insult its audience and to defame its originator, and yet it was made. In the lead up to its release, some of the press had similar thoughts of Cryu's Dune. How could a game be made of a disastrous movie production that was, in turn, based on an unfilmable novel? And yet, it was made. A game about mining spice, fighting a war, developing psychic powers, becoming a prophet, and terraforming a planet. And maybe that, in itself, is worth something. Dune's visuals are primarily the child of the original 1984 movie and then Cryu's own artistic sensibilities, but the hardware at play did have some influence on the game's look. There are 4 versions of Dune available: the original releases for Amiga and PC, the CD-ROM version, and the Mega CD port. The Amiga and MS-DOS versions are not quite identical, but are similar enough to pass at a casual glance. This was actually unusual for Cryu. In the days of Exhaust, the DOS ports of games often looked substantially worse than the Amiga releases due to being targeted at weaker hardware. Games like Captain Blood or Cult were clearly superior on Commodore machines. But this situation had already started to change when Cryu were founded in 1990, and by Dune's release in 1992, Amiga releases were not as impressive as they had been. Still, Amiga machines remained popular in Europe, so this is how Dune is remembered today in many people's memories. Aside from the colour composition, the most noticeable difference between the Amiga and MS-DOS versions of Dune is the interface and a tiny number of background screens, as you can see here with the Encyclopedia, for example. Other than that, the 2 versions are aesthetically pretty close. In both cases, Lynch's 1984 movie looms large. Despite the critical backlash, most critics praised Dune's visuals, especially the set design, miniature work, and costumes. Ron Miller, an artist on the movie, has said that the team working under Lynch used very little of the art that was created for earlier productions under Jodorowsky and Ridley Scott. Miller pointed out that Frank Herbert was a fairly, quote, on-visual writer, so the team had to come up with their own vision, although they did borrow some elements, such as the look of the sandworms, from Dune artist John Schoenherr. In Cryu's Dune, we can see these influences very clearly, from the stunning noir baroque environments created for Lynch by Tony Masters, to the iconic costume design of Bob Ringwald. But Cryu had a lot of gaps to fill in. There are several locations in Dune that were either never depicted or only glimpsed in the theatrical cut of the 1984 film. In the game, players finally get to visit places mentioned in the original book, like the Secret Palace Garden or the Fremen hydroponics farms. And Cryu had to draw from other sources when visualizing the Rakian villages, oases, and fortifications, from 70s futurism to the First Gulf War. But there are scenes from the movie that are completely absent in Cryu's Dune. The 1984 production designed 4 distinct worlds: the stormy Atreides homeworld of Caladan, the Harkonnen industrial pits of Gedi Prime, the Imperial Seat, and of course Arrakis itself. Not only did Cryu cut 3 of these worlds, they consciously altered some of the remaining designs. The Fremen outfits and Atreides uniforms are generally quite faithful to the movie, but the Harkonnen soldiers are of a completely new design, apparently a cross between Darth Vader and concept art from the failed 1974 production. But changes in the visual design are most obvious in the characters themselves. Virgin desperately wanted to have the star-studded cast of the Lynch movie in their game, but using an actor's likeness is a tricky legal process. In the end, Virgin did nab their greatest prize, Kyle MacLachlan, who played Paul Atreides. MacLachlan's career had floundered in the immediate aftermath of Dune's failure, but his relationship with David Lynch would bring him back into the spotlight. Thanks to his role as Agent Dale Cooper in the serial drama Twin Peaks, McLachlan was again a household name, and Virgin were thrilled at the opportunity to plaster his face all over their marketing material. According to reports, Virgin had the rights to several other cast members, but the only clearly recognisable face is that of Francesca Annis as Jessica, who, as far as I can tell, isn't even acknowledged in the credits. Most of the other characters bear almost no resemblance to their filmic counterparts, though, ironically enough, Feyd-Rautha Harkonnen does still look a bit like Sting, despite the singer having explicitly revoked permission for Virgin to use his likeness. According to Danielle Ishbia, Crew modelled the remaining NPCs on famous faces of pop culture and contemporaneous Middle Eastern politics. Libyan statesmen, Iranian ayatollahs, famous writers, artists, and other figures. Perhaps Crew intended players to recall media footage of the day, with international celebrities being interviewed in front of sandy backdrops. The overall effect, to me, is slightly odd, with some of the NPCs looking like concept art sketches, and others retaining an almost eerie realism. I'm one of the few people who really liked McLachlan as Paul in the 1984 movie, but he looks a bit off in Crew's game, and I wonder if the original, less realistic design would have fit better. Part of the problem is the double-edged sword of the NPCs' faces being fully animated. This was really impressive in 1992, but it does come across a bit strangely in-game, with friendly characters randomly winking at Paul and antagonistic NPCs occasionally being possessed by demons. Paul himself gets the lion's share of fine detail in character animations. He becomes noticeably gaunt after travelling in the desert, a little reference to Fremen observations from the novels, and his eyes slowly take on that distinctive blue tint as he spends more time on Arrakis. Since we're on the subject of animations, we should mention what the CD-ROM release brought to the table. In terms of visuals, the biggest change is the addition of pre-rendered scenes for Dune's landscape and movie clips from the 1984 film. When travelling across Dune's surface in the original release, the first-person view would accurately represent what was depicted on the map screen. This meant, for example, that the player could spot landmarks like CHs or palaces from a distance. The CD-ROM release replaced all of this with FMV cutscenes when travelling by Orni, and pre-rendered images for individual scenes. When going by air, you're simply watching several looping videos spliced together, with unique clips for arriving at a specific location. And when going by foot, you won't see landmarks until you're right on top of them. These backgrounds and FMV cutscenes are definitely a huge leap in visual quality, but they do slightly detract from the sense of immersion, a forewarning of the dark age of cinematic CD-ROM adventure games. I suspect this has some effect on gameplay as well, since the FMV clips significantly extend the amount of time it takes to travel by Orni from one location to another. The addition of clips from the movie is a nice touch, but I doubt many people watched any of these, except for the introduction, with the painfully beautiful Virginia Madsen as Princess Irulan. The rest of these clips are squirreled away in the encyclopedia, and quite frankly the quality is so poor that I get a headache when looking directly at them. But the CD-ROM release brought more substantial changes in the audio department. The 1992 Amiga release of Dune was noticeably lacking in aural feedback, whilst the MS-DOS version had some sound effects depending on your hardware. The CD-ROM versions included all this and more, from the muted rumble of distant artillery to the thunderous roar of a sandworm, but an even bigger addition was that of fully voiced dialogue.
Welcome to our siege, Paul Atreides.
Though not a fully fledged adventure game, Dune is still pretty heavy on text and exposition, so the cost of having all that recorded must have been a major expense for Virgin. At the time, a minority of reviewers criticised the actor's delivery, which seems rather unfair considering the state of voice acting in the early 90s. Personally, I think the investment paid off, to the extent that I was happy to leave the subtitles off and listen to the whole monologue, so long as it wasn't being repeated. There is a slight crackle to the audio files, but I actually found this useful, since the distortion audibly cuts off when the actor has finished speaking all their lines.
Ah, Paul, how I miss our planet, Caladan, with its oceans and This is so different.
I thought Jessica's VA was particularly good, though I'm not sure about the actress for Cheney, whose voice sounded oddly strained at times.
Oh, Paul, this moment is unique. Being here next to you with all these worlds above us.
I was a lot less keen on the Harkonnen characters, though this isn't really the fault of the VAs. We'll come back to this later in the video, but in short, the Harkonnen come across as an absolute joke. The rank and file talk like villains from a Saturday morning cartoon.
I will tell you something in exchange of my life.
And Feyd-Rautha's taunts are just as comical. Lynch's Harkonnens certainly weren't subtle, but they did project a certain amount of menace. Where Crew completely broke with Lynch's movie was in Dune's soundtrack. The score for the 1984 film was handled by soft rock band Toto, with contributions by Brian Eno and others. It was generally well received for being a memorable blend of electronic guitar action and orchestral grandeur, fitting for an 80s sci-fi epic. The soundtrack to Crew's Dune is a completely different beast. The music was made using the Urbulo ad-lib system, also known as ERAD, which was created by Crew's Remy Urbulo and Stefan Peek, and came out of their frustration with the limitations of existing formats. Peek is credited as the composer for Dune's music, although some sources claim Philip Ulrich was involved. The score is about as far from the 1984 music as you could possibly get. It's not just the sounds themselves, but there's a consistent jauntiness to it that puts it very much in the pre-Myst era of video game music, before Hollywood-style soundtracks became the norm for adventure games. There are one or two more traditional compositions, like the opening music for the CD-ROM version, but most tracks are clearly meant to be looped for long periods of time without annoying or distracting the player. That's not to give the impression that Peek's music is repetitive in any way. One track plays up the sci-fi edge by emphasizing the electronic sounds of heavy equipment beeping away in the background. One evokes Arrakis' tribal desert culture with flutes and drums, yet another track immerses the player in the mysticism of the Fremen prophecies. Of course, as with many games of the era, there are several versions of the soundtrack depending on your hardware. The ad-lib soundtrack is probably the best known, since this is what the music was originally composed for and covered the widest range of sound cards back in 1992. The later Sega CD version is heavily modelled on the ad-lib soundtrack but uses the console sound chip, and thus comes out quite strangely, almost like playing the PC version on misconfigured drivers. My personal favourite is the Roland MT32 soundtrack, especially the Ornithopter and CD-ROM opening tracks, but some fans dislike this version. Although it didn't have the hardware limitations of the ad-lib music, it also lost some of the synthetic or digitised quality, perhaps coming across as less dreamlike and more mundane to some listeners. The Amiga soundtrack is quite different to all of these. This version is credited to an Alex Ekian, who I wasn't able to find much information about, but appears to have dealt with the music for several Amiga ports. There are only 3 or 4 tracks to this score, and as with the Roland soundtrack, it was criticised for being overly busy, cluttering up the original tracks with unnecessary additions. I have to defend Ekian's work here, as I think it deviates far enough from the original music to be memorable in its own right. If you've never heard it before, then it's worth checking out the Ecolove track at the very least. Despite bearing no resemblance to the 1984 soundtrack by Toto, the critical response to Peek's soundtrack was very similar, with some reviewers arguing it was the game's greatest strength. In fact, Virgin Music would release an official CD album for Dune, which was extremely unusual for a game soundtrack in the early 90s. Dune's Spice Opera is actually not the original ad-lib or Roland soundtrack, but a reimagining of it by Peek and Ulrich. The album is something of a collector's item today, as the rights were later transferred to EMI Records, who never re-released it and refused to transfer the copyright back to Stefan Peek. Peek has said that he hopes the album will be made freely available one day, and implied that he has no issue with fans acquiring it from unofficial sources in the meantime. I'm not too keen on spice opera myself, it's a little too avant-garde for my taste, but have a listen on YouTube if you're interested. So, that brings us to how we can play Dune today. Cru's Dune is not sold on any digital distribution platforms, so the only formal means of acquiring it is an old physical copy. According to a 2019 article in PC Gamer, Good Old Games have been attempting to secure the rights from the current license holders, the Frank Herbert estate, for some time, but the Herbert estate have rebuffed them. I won't say Dune will never be available. 2 weeks after I made a similar pronouncement in my Chronomaster review, the game suddenly popped up on GOG, but at the moment the signs aren't very promising. Still, like most games in the same straits, Dune is pretty widely available on abandonware sites, with no indication the current rights holders are particularly interested in going after them. The floppy disk MS-DOS version of Dune is the easiest to find, although the versions I checked needed further configuration before I could get any sound out of them. The Amiga port is also quite easy to find, and though it's generally considered slightly inferior to the DOS version, I didn't have any issues emulating it. I don't have personal experience with the Sega CD port of Dune. From what I've gathered, it should run fine on emulators, but I don't see much reason to pick it over the CD-ROM DOS release, unless you really want to use a controller or just hate working in DOSBox. Now, running a game from the CD-ROM rather than floppy does take a few more steps in DOSBox, especially if you want to set up Roland MT32 emulation as well, but in my opinion it's worth it. Whilst the encyclopedia clips don't add much, the new graphics and fully voiced dialogue are a major bonus over the 1992 release. But in the end, I wouldn't say any port of Dune is substantially worse than another. The gameplay experience, plus the majority of NPCs and interior backgrounds are almost identical across every version. If you want to play Dune, just pick whatever platform you're comfortable with and enjoy yourself.
Paul, you had a vision, didn't you?
This vision stuff is beyond my comprehension. How did he know?
Well, come and see me later, Paul, and I'll explain all of this to you.
Dune is set in the far future, with humanity spread across the stars in a neo-feudal galactic empire. Much of humanity is ruled by the noble houses of the Landsrat, such as House Atreides of the planet Caladan, or House Harkonnen of Gadi Prime. The nominal head of this empire is Emperor Shaddam IV of House Corrino, but there are several other powerful organisations that operate within its boundaries. One is the Bene Gesserit Sisterhood, women with superhuman abilities whose public face is that of diplomats, mediators, advisors, and tutors for young women of the noble houses. Another is the Spacing Guild, whose titanic highliners are humanity's only means of safely conducting faster-than-light travel between planetary systems. But neither of these organisations can function without the aid of the Spice Melange. The spice is key to the Bene Gesserit's mystical powers, and the source of the mutated Guild Navigator's ability to fold space and time. The spice can also extend a human lifespan by several hundred years, and is a potent drug that creates a crippling physical dependency in those who use it. This makes spice the most valuable commodity in the known universe, and it can only be produced in one place, the desert planet Arrakis, also known as Dune. Dune is a harsh place, deadly to the unprepared, populated by gigantic sandworms, the desert-dwelling tribes of the Fremen, and some scattered communities of smugglers. The only urban areas are those critical to the Empire's spice mining operations. Whoever is granted the rights to oversee these operations gains great power and wealth, but should they fail to meet the Emperor's spice quotas, punishment will be swift. Traditionally, House Harkonnen has held the rights to spice mining on Dune, with Baron Vladimir Harkonnen employing the typical Harkonnen tools of brutality and slave labour to meet the Imperial quota. But in an unprecedented move, the Emperor has decreed that House Atreides may come to Dune to compete with the Harkonnens. Duke Leto Atreides arrives on Dune with his Bene Gesserit concubine Jessica, their son Paul, and a core of their most trusted retainers. The Duke is moulding Paul to be a worthy successor, and puts him to work arranging an alliance between House Atreides and the native Fremen tribes. Paul soon discovers that the proximity of so much spice is changing him in ways that only his Bene Gesserit mother can comprehend, unlocking abilities that will be critical in defeating both the Harkonnens and the power behind them. Assessing Dune's writing is difficult, as the game is operating on several levels, not only as a self-contained story, but also as an adaptation of Lynch's movie and, supposedly, a nod to the original novel. As its own thing, Creighton's writing is, at best, passable. The prose sometimes reads very strangely, with quirks of grammar and syntax that give the impression of an overly literal translation from a different tongue. Perhaps Creux used specific quotes from the French language version of the novel, which were then translated back into English for the international release of the game and ended up very stilted. It's not awful, but it might be a little distracting to a native speaker. Taking a broader view of the narrative, it's very workmanlike. Dune should be a universe of mystery and wonder, deep musings on religion and rulers, Byzantine plots within plots. But the story in Creux's Dune is quite prosaic, bereft of interesting characters or complex motivations. One could defend Creugh on the basis that they had to streamline things, but the decisions they made strip so much away from the source material that both the game and what's left of the original story are diminished by them. Documenting each and every example of how Creux's Dune deviates from Lynch and Herbert would be extremely time-consuming, and is better left to an expert on the topic. But it is worth discussing the topic in a broader sense, as it's relevant to how enjoyable Dune's story is on its own merits, and how faithfully it captures the spirit of the original work. It's not surprising that Dune makes changes to the source material to fit the tale into video game format. Whether or not Baron Harkonnen is portrayed as a homosexual pederast, for example, is really not all that pertinent to a tactical adventure game. But the choices Creugh made can sometimes stretch the limits of logic and comprehensibility. Take Imperial politics. Creugh are a bit too thrifty with details on the Landsraad, or the role of Duke Leto as a figurehead in opposition to House Corrino. Also, the subplot involving the Imperial Sardaukar and the role of harsh planetary conditions in breeding elite troops is excised. Similarly, internal politics involving the Baron, Feyd-Rautha, and the Beast Raban are absent. The overall effect of these changes is to make many of the events seem random or nonsensical. In the game, why is Shaddam IV doing what he does? Why do the Atreides leadership come to a hostile planet with a tiny retinue? How could House Harkonnen and House Atreides be present on Dune and mining spice at the same time? What are the Emperor's Sardaukar doing all this time? Why do the major factions of the Empire meekly concede to the events of the ending? It's understandable that Creugh couldn't simply copy the original novel to explain these things. Some critics describe Dune as dull or impenetrable due to the extensive use of internal monologues for exposition and character growth. Lynch's movie was subject to similar criticism. But Creux's Dune is not a 2 or 3 hour movie, it's, at minimum, something like 5 to 10 hours of text and dialogue heavy gameplay. Instead of having characters constantly repeat the exact same information hundreds of times, NPCs could have made unobtrusive side comments here and there that helped players subconsciously grasp the finer details of why these things are happening. Instead, Creugh often introduced characters in a very inelegant way, pretending that Paul has suffered some sort of concussion and needs to be reminded of the name and purpose of his own family and advisors. It reminded me of the opening chapters to Hunters of Dune, where Herbert's successors regurgitated mountains of backstory in the most stunningly inept way imaginable. Creux's use of exposition isn't quite that bad, but critical information is sometimes communicated poorly, and subtler points of economics and power dynamics are ignored completely. Creugh didn't simply trim the fat from Dune, they went at it with a giant cleaver, chopping off critical parts of the story and mangling others. It's not just a case of, say, removing characters, but distorting some of the remaining ones so that they're presented as completely different people. Cutting characters like Shadeout Mapes or Jamis is probably not such a big deal, but depicting Gurney Halleck as a wizened military advisor or Duncan Idaho as some sort of mild-mannered bureaucrat is a baffling departure from both book and movie. We don't even get a good sense of why the Atreides and Harkonnen are at odds. Halleck and Idaho's attitude towards the Harkonnen is more one of mild perturbance than real hatred. And going by the game, who could blame them? The Harkonnen are presented as the bad guys, but there's not much reason for the player to hold any particular animosity towards them. Beyond references to their enslavement of the Fremen and the general unpleasantness of warfare, they're more comical than genuinely evil.
These Fremen of yours, they're just a bunch of punks. Did you intend to frighten the great Harkonnens with them? You haven't a chance. You will soon die.
At one point, an important character is kidnapped by the Harkonnen, who proceed to not really do very much to them, and then let your forces simply march in and liberate the character after a battle. This is certainly not the kind of behaviour exhibited by Lynch or Herbert's Harkonnen. In fact, life really doesn't get too bad for most characters in the game. Several characters from both factions who suffer nasty fates in the source material are given a stay of execution by Crew. The worst scene in the game is actually exclusive to the player, who gets to see Paul's own unpleasant demise in the event they do something wrong. It's a pretty bloodless game overall, as if violence and death are distant concepts to the inhabitants of Arrakis. This is especially galling to see applied to the Fremen. In Herbert's book, the Fremen are meant to be a harsh people, whose lifestyle necessitates purging the weak and killing their own wounded. They are intensely xenophobic and usually hostile to outsiders, and whilst Lynch's Fremen aren't quite as brutal, they're still presented as extremely dangerous. Crew's depiction of the Fremen is almost jovial in comparison.
Yahoo! We won the battle, Muad'Dib!
At the start of the game, most tribes are quick to side with the Atreides and are merely a bit tight-lipped towards Paul. There's certainly no sense of death being a few poorly chosen words away. It's not long before the Fremen are inviting Paul to flirt with their woman and uncover their most closely guarded secrets. On the subject of woman, this is another area where it seems like Crew originally had bigger plans than what ended up in the final product. Despite all the other changes, Crew chose not to cut the relatively minor character of the Fremen widow Hara. In the book, Hara's husband is killed by Paul, but this doesn't happen in the game. There's a little meta-joke about Jamis having been slain by some boy. Hara becomes somewhat flirty with Paul, and several other characters among both the Atreides and Fremen comment on this. But the budding romance comes to an abrupt end when Hara asks to be returned to her CH. I wonder if Crew meant to have some sort of alternate romance route with Hara rather than Chani? Chani herself isn't all that important. Though almost ever present during the latter half of the game, she doesn't really have much to say or do, even less than in Lynch's work. But of all the female characters, it's the Lady Jessica who loses the most in Crew's version. Jessica is a big part of the novel, almost a second protagonist at certain points in the story. Translating many of her scenes to the silver screen is a challenge, due to them often involving very minor side plots or being heavy on internal dialogue, but Lynch was still able to include some of her most important moments. In the game, Jessica, like Duncan Idaho, is locked up in the palace for most of the campaign, rewarded with the occasional visit so as to find a hidden room or dispense some pearls of wisdom, and then ignored again. It's a sad fate for a character with so much material to work from. Putting aside her contributions during the first half of the book, Jessica spends most of the early Fremen chapters in fear for her life, one mistake away from being killed for the water in her body. She's a critical part of Paul's acceptance by the natives of Arrakis, but in-game she barely has any interaction with the Fremen at all, meaning Crew failed to explore the undercurrent of violence inherent to the Fremen's culture and religious beliefs. The reason I dwell on this neutering of the Fremen isn't just because they act differently to the novel, but because here Crew managed to outdo Lynch and depart even further from one of the core themes of Frank Herbert's work. I mentioned earlier that Herbert was actually very positive towards the movie, pointing out that some of his favourite scenes were cut from the theatrical version by no fault of David Lynch. Herbert's main complaint of the movie was that it played the trope of a messianic saviour completely straight. Herbert has said that Dune is, in part, a warning about heroes. Herbert drew upon Arthurian legends of divinely ordained leaders and shaped it into a parable about the dangers of charismatic prophets and the way such men influence their followers, knowingly or not. In the novel, Paul is an artificial messiah to the Fremen, an unintentional side effect of the religion spread by the Bene Gesserit's missionaries thousands of years prior. It's not entirely correct to say that Paul and Jessica manipulated the Fremen. It was the Fremen who ensnared the two in their prophecies the moment they set foot on Arrakis, and the two rode these prophecies to their violent climax, sometimes directing them, sometimes merely dragged along by the forces they helped set in motion. The final cut of Lynch's movie subverted this message to the point that it, rather ironically, reverted to its original form, a fantastical narrative of a divinely ordained leader, a sci-fi fisher king whose ascendancy literally transforms the land itself. But even in Lynch's movie, there are hints of a darker side to the legend of Muad'Dib, suggestions of a superhuman tyrant and a galactic jihad that haunt Paul's prescient sight. Crew's narrative ignores this. The Fremen prophecies are entirely genuine, and neither Paul nor Jessica intentionally take advantage of religion or language to secure the Fremen's allegiance. Religion and language are not really questioned in Crew's Dune. Prophecies are real because they're prophecies, and language reflects preordained truth. In one scene, the Fremen bestow the name Muad'Dib upon Paul, rather than Paul specifically choosing that name and all it implies. Nor are the Fremen particularly violent or fanatical in the game. They are portrayed as a noble people liberating themselves from oppression. It's akin to a simple fantasy tale of bad rulers toppled by a prophesized chosen one, and I can't agree with the claim made by some reviewers that Crew's Dune is in any way more faithful to the novel than Lynch's movie. I think part of this perception probably comes from the addition of ecology to Dune's strategic gameplay. Crew certainly deserve credit for resisting the temptation to excise this part of Dune. When creating a video game adaptation of a novel, most developers would probably see a bunch of appendix chapters about planting vegetation and importing wildlife as the first thing they could cut. But I think this part of the game is often overstated. Ecology and sustainability is not really dealt with as a philosophical concept, but merely a tool of warfare or administration. The idea of hoarding resources as a tool of statecraft does pop up a lot in later Dune books, but in Crew's Dune it's a matter of gameplay mechanics and not food for thought. I read several reviews claiming that there was some sort of secret ending to Dune, a so-called environmentalist route, but I'm unaware of any evidence supporting this claim. It's simply an alternate means of driving Harkonnen out of their basic fortresses, and not a wholesale alternative to violence. For this reason, the role of ecology in Crew's Dune is not really that much more sophisticated than resource management in Westwood's Dune or any other traditional RTS. So my problem with Crew's writing isn't that it's especially bad by the standards of 1992, it's more a reaction to claims I've seen elsewhere that Crew improved upon the 1984 movie. Despite its reputation for being incomprehensible, Lynch's Dune is both a better self-contained story than Crew's Dune, and infinitely more respectful to the original novel. Fans who were hoping for a more faithful video game adaptation than the movie would face disappointment in Crew's Dune. It would be over 20 years before something remotely like that arrived. And that something would be a pornographic adventure game made in Adobe Flash.
Paul with a girl. I knew this would happen. She's quite charming, but don't let her distract you from your goals.
The Dune franchise is no stranger to the beast with two backs. The original trilogy, Dune, Dune Messiah, and Children of Dune all featured sex, as well as references to incest and sexual violence, though the passages themselves weren't too explicit. But from the fourth book onwards, Herbert wrote much more openly about the subject, not only in terms of the content itself, but from the perspective of religion, warfare, and power dynamics. God Emperor of Dune featured lengthy discussions on the mass sublimation of male and female sexuality. Heretics examined the relationship between morality and gratification, and Chapter House had a strong preoccupation with the use of sex as a tool of control. These later titles even included brief scenes involving bestiality and a sexual encounter between an adult woman and a 10-year-old boy. But there were limits to what Herbert considered acceptable. In a 1985 article, Harlan Ellison made an extraordinary claim regarding director Ridley Scott's abandoned 1979 movie adaptation. Ellison claims that in screenwriter Rudolf Wurlitz's script, Paul was to have engaged in an incestuous affair with his mother Jessica, reportedly causing Herbert to bellow with rage upon learning of the script's existence. It's hard to believe that Wurlitzer thought this would fly in a major motion picture, even in the 70s, and Ron Miller of the Lynch production has attributed this plot point to Alejandro Jodorowsky's Dune, not Scott and Wurlitzer's. But Brian Herbert backs up this claim in his father's autobiography, Dreamer of Dune, saying that Herbert's specific objection was that Dune fans would never accept such a transgressive relationship between the two characters. But Herbert, it seems, was wrong. Behind the Dune first appeared in 2016 as a free interactive flash adventure, created by artist David Balsamiq as a tribute to, and pornographic spoof of, Cryu's 1992 game. As a general rule, pornographic parodies are not considered to be particularly respectful towards the source material. They're more commonly quick cash-ins, meant to take advantage of the popularity of the original work whilst using the label of parody as legal protection. And I can't pretend that Frank Herbert would have appreciated, say, depicting the Bene Gesserit pain box as a masturbation device. But whatever Balsamiq's intent with Behind the Dune, the final product displays a remarkable appreciation for the Dune universe, in both its original literary form and other manifestations. Visually, the game is extremely impressive for a fan-made project, with over a dozen unique backdrops, about 24 NPCs, plus numerous items, vehicles, and animated environmental props. The game is recognisably modelled on the characters, costumes, and locations of Cryu's game, though seems to have taken visual inspiration from other sources, like the David Lynch movie where needed. The art itself is excellent, clearly of professional quality and easily matching or exceeding the quality of what you might see in a full-price indie game. Due to being worked on for several years, there are one or two instances where it's pretty obvious an asset was made much earlier in the development process than the rest of the art, but this is a very minor criticism. More noticeable is that the project did start as a Flash game, and whilst this is no longer the case, the animation quality is not the best. It's actually not so bad for action scenes and general gameplay, where you can pass it off as part of the animation style, but it looks rather embarrassing during the actual sex scenes. We'll come back to the pornographic parody part later though, as Behind the Dune is described as a remake or a tribute to Cryu's game, so let's examine it in that context. Behind the Dune employs the same point-and-click adventure gameplay of Cryu's Dune, but removes most of the strategic elements, aside from the basics of spice harvesting and equipment. There's a very small map with a few areas the Fremen can be sent to mine for spice, but the Harkonnen armies are more or less absent, and there aren't any fortresses to conquer. The whole ecological system is gone, and Fremen motivation isn't really an issue. To compensate for the removal of the strategy mechanics, Behind the Dune focuses more on the adventure side of gameplay. In Cryu's game, there are a small number of plot-relevant NPCs and then a jumble of generic Fremen and smuggler leaders, but Behind the Dune removes all these extraneous NPCs and instead enlarges the pool of unique characters. Most of the characters from Lynch's movie are restored, whilst some of those already present in Cryu's game, such as Duncan Idaho and Vladimir Harkonnen, have been modified to be a bit closer to their canonical versions. In the 1992 game, unique NPCs only really had one dialogue option, the Talk to Me button, whereas in Behind the Dune there are usually several options open for discussion, many of them relating to the game's numerous side quests. Some of these discussions are irrelevant or simple jokes, but even these often include references to minor plot points or curious factoids from the Dune universe. NPCs from the palace are also more willing to travel with Paul to other locations, so there are more situations in which they can offer hints or help solve a problem than in the original game. Another way in which Behind the Dune improves upon Cryu's title is in restoring some of the environmental interaction that was expected of a 90s point-and-click adventure. The 1992 game was seriously lacking in this department, with something like 3 or 4 items to interact with in the entire campaign. There's much more of this in the remake, like finding discarded quest items or hidden switches, not to mention some poking and prodding of NPCs that I won't show here, and even a couple of action sequences. It's still well short of the options available in a proper point-and-click adventure, like Cryu's own KGB, but it's a big improvement over the original game. Of course, the problem with all these extra options and side quests is the problem inherent to many pornographic games. In a traditional game, the player is engaging with these mechanics in order to gain some advantage for themselves, to further the main plot, improve their character, acquire resources, solve a puzzle, and so on. Pornographic games replace these rewards with, well, porn. In Behind the Dune, a significant proportion of the dialogue and side quests revolve around unlocking erotic content than in-game advantages. There is an option to disable the pornographic scenes in Behind the Dune, but this doesn't make Behind the Dune more of a game, just the same game with less content. Behind the Dune is primarily a pornographic game, and not so much a real game with erotic content as a bonus. So much of the appeal of playing Behind the Dune comes from wanting to see Dune porn, and whether that's enough is dependent on how much you like that porn. Behind the Dune was in development for roughly 5 years or so, and caters to a fair number of tastes, some of them particularly niche. The kind of person willing to play an erotic adventure game is probably not going to be too bothered by most of what's depicted, but there is stuff that may very well push the boundaries of the average player's tastes. There's a button in the communications room that lets you disable some of the more extreme animations, but even then I found a couple of the scenes in Behind the Dune really quite unpleasant, only slightly mitigated by being in cartoon form. The point I want to make here is that even assuming you're comfortable with the pornographic content, you're still left with a pretty short and simplistic point-and-click adventure and almost none of the strategic gameplay of the 1992 game. So why did I imply earlier that Behind the Dune is somehow more faithful to the Dune universe than Cryu's Dune? Well, because everything in the game, from the side quests to the aforementioned eroticism, is rooted in that universe. Many things in Behind the Dune are far more accurate to the book and movie than Cryu's game. It obviously makes some significant departures, partly for the sake of including more pornographic scenes, and partly, I assume, to ensure that it's legally regarded as a parody. Some of the male characters are absent, 2 characters are gender-bent, 1 character likes to steal Jessica's dresses, and so forth. But the extent to which even the most ridiculous changes are justified within the context of canonical sources is impressive. Take the following example. At one point, Paul has to discover the location of the Atreides family atomics, which was a minor plot point in the original novel. To do so, he can employ the services of the Tleilaxu and create a Gola clone of a dead ally, which was a significant plot point in Dune Messiah. But to restore the Gola's memories, he has to force them to engage in a sexual encounter, which is something that occurs in Chapter House Dune. There are lots of examples like this, with Behind the Dune mining the novels for everything from major events to obscure bits of trivia, and then incorporating these into the gameplay, story, or pornographic scenes. Meeting a certain spice quota means the Fremen can bribe the Spacing Guild to restrict satellite surveillance. Investigating an assassination attempt in the palace lets Paul expose a traitor and modify the original course of events. An item of Harkonnen jewellery triggers a side quest that foreshadows the events of the third novel. It's not just about referencing the novels or movie, but making the setting seem richer and more alive. One might counter that David Balsamic had a huge advantage over Crew in that he wasn't restricted to referencing the 1984 movie and nothing else. But as we saw earlier in the video, Crew didn't even make use of half the characters and events of Lynch's film. They streamlined and simplified the movie to such an extent that they did the worst thing possible, which was to make the Dune universe seem even smaller and less interesting than it seemed in the 1984 movie. Behind the Dune deserves credit for reversing that mistake. It may not be an entirely faithful remake of Crew's Dune, and has little justification to call itself a tactical or strategic adventure anymore, but for all its silliness, it reminds you that Dune was a complicated story with many moving parts. One existing in a great big universe of diverse peoples, scheming factions, compelling philosophies, and wondrous technologies. If not a true remake, then Behind the Dune is at least a renewal of sorts.
The water of life extends consciousness, but only a few people are able to absorb it and live. Would you like to try it, Mandeep?
Originally, I wanted to end this video by saying something like, though Dune 2 deserves its reputation as the grandfather of real-time strategy, Crew's Dune is the more ambitious and interesting title of the two. But then I saw that pretty much every retrospective of Crew's Dune ends this way. And it got me thinking, is that really a compliment to Crew? Dune 2's legacy endured because Westwood invented a new way of playing strategy games, one that was accessible, intuitive, and enjoyable. Crew's Dune is interesting because, in retrospect, it failed. As a point-and-click adventure, it's shallow. As a strategy game, it's monotonous, and even as an adaptation, whether of the movie or the book, it often falls short. People kept coming back to Dune 2 many years after its original release. It got an official remake and more than one fan-made source port, but Dune is like some old display piece in a technology museum. People like looking at it, studying it, discussing it and whatnot, but very few people are actually interested in using it again. And it struggles to retain even that small space in history. There were a few attempts at modding the game or making a source port over the years, but I'm pretty sure David Balsamic's porn remake is the biggest thing to happen to Crew's Dune since 1994. You'll sometimes see people talk about how they'd like to see a real remake of the game, and it certainly deserves a re-release for modern systems, but I can't see a studio reproducing Crew's overall approach. It's rare to see traditional point-and-click adventure games outside the indie scene these days, and when professional teams get involved with the genre, they're more likely to focus on the cinematic or story-driven side of things, aka the dreaded interactive movie or walking sim. That Behind the Dune improved on the adventure game mechanics at all is a big point in its favour. As for the strategy gameplay, it's both shallow and overcomplicated, thanks to a clunky interface and control scheme, and by modern standards would probably be considered equivalent to a simple mobile game. Dune 2 always had an unfair advantage. It wasn't trying to capture the whole grand sweep of Paul Atreides' ascension to Muad'Dib, merely a tiny sliver of those experiences in building wind traps and ordering soldiers about. Were Crew doomed from the very start, then? Should they have done what Behind the Dune did and just focused on a specific gameplay niche? Maybe, but then, like Dune 2, it wouldn't have been a Dune game at all. It would have been a game that happened to take place in the Dune universe. You can't adapt Herbert or Lynch's Dune to video game form if you're just going to simulate a very small part of Paul's adventures. Dune wasn't just about killing people with crysknives or collecting spice, it was also some of the things Crew tried to include. With the release of Denis Villeneuve's Dune Part 1, there's been a small resurgence in Dune video games, but it doesn't take superhuman prescience to guess that mobile titles or yet another multiplayer survival game aren't going to be expanding anyone's consciousness. As of making this video, Dune Spice Wars, a real-time with pause empire builder, is the closest thing to a real Dune game on the horizon, but it seems like it'll be treading a very well-worn path as far as gameplay mechanics go. I don't think any of these titles will match Crew's attempt. They may very well be good games, just like Westwood's Dune, but they don't bring us any closer to adapting the original story. A modern adaptation in the vein of Crew's Dune would, by necessity, have to be madly ambitious, including mechanics from tactical war games, adventure games, empire builders, and even RPGs. It would also need developers with an extensive knowledge and deep understanding of the source material. I don't know if such a game is even possible. But if there's one thing Crew did right, it's showing that they tried. And if they could make a game out of that, even if it's not the best game, then so could someone else. I hope you enjoyed this retrospective of Crew's Dune. Anyone who's willing to watch this video all the way through is probably already quite familiar with the franchise, but just in case you're not, I recommend looking into Frank Herbert's original 1965 novel at the very least, as it's a perfectly good read by itself, and if you do enjoy it, you can move on to subsequent books. Of course, Crew's game wouldn't exist in the first place were it not for the 1984 movie. David Lynch's adaptation is well worth watching. I can't promise you it's a good movie, but it is a unique and memorable one, which is perhaps even better. I'd recommend watching the original theatrical cut first, not the extended edition, and then one of the fan edits with some of the deleted footage. Also, you might have noticed I didn't really talk about the sci-fi miniseries in this video, entitled Frank Herbert's Dune, broadcast in the year 2000, and the sequel series Children of Dune from 2003. These shows were aired almost 10 years after Crew's game, and thus weren't really relevant to the video, but they're an admirable attempt to adapt the first 3 novels and are, again, worth watching. Finally, I didn't reference the most recent movie by Denis Villeneuve, as once again it has no bearing on the game, but if it tempts anyone into exploring the original work, that's all well and good. And now you've all gotten your homework assignments, I think I can drop the curtain on Dune. With all this talk of French games, we might as well make the next review another Gallic adventure, so expect a video on 1996's Timegate, Knight's Chase in a month or two. In the meantime, I hope you all take care of yourselves and have a great day. I'll see you all again very soon.